The Thessalonians were inhabitants of the ancient city of Thessalonica, located in what is now northern Greece. It was a key city in Macedonia and an important commercial hub in the Roman Empire. Due to its strategic location and mixed population, Thessalonica was a cultural melting pot, home to both Greeks and Romans, and influenced by various pagan religious traditions. In Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, he wrote with great concern for the community, knowing that many among them were already observing aspects of the Torah. While his letters were addressed to both Jews and Gentiles who had converted to belief in Jesus as the Messiah, Paul was keenly aware that many of the Gentile believers had been learning and embracing the ethical teachings of the Torah as part of their commitment to living a life pleasing to God. The context of Torah observance in Thessalonica. Thessalonica, as a major city in the Roman Empire, was home to a diverse population, including a significant Jewish community. The Jewish believers in Jesus were naturally Torah observant, adhering to the commandments of the law as part of their covenantal identity. When Gentiles in the city converted to Christianity, many of them were drawn to the ethical teachings and moral standards found in the Torah, especially those dealing with idolatry, sexual morality, and justice. Paul, as a Jewish apostle, had a deep respect for the Torah and saw it as foundational to understanding God's holiness and moral expectations. He taught that faith in Jesus did not nullify the Torah but fulfilled it in a spiritual sense, as Jesus represented the true embodiment of righteousness. However, for the Gentile believers, Paul did expect over time the people to meet the requirements of the Torah, such as circumcision or dietary laws, but he did expect them to follow its core moral principles. Paul's concerns for the Thessalonians' faithfulness. In writing his letters to the Thessalonians, Paul was aware that many of the believers were already practicing key aspects of Torah-based living, especially those parts of the law that dealt with ethical behavior. He was concerned, however, that the pressures of living in a predominantly pagan city might cause some of them to waver in their faithfulness to these teachings. Thessalonica was steeped in pagan worship, including idolatry, sexual immorality, and civic religious festivals. These were difficult temptations for new converts who had once been immersed in such practices. In writing his letters to the Thessalonians, Paul was aware that many of the believers were already practicing key aspects of Torah-based living, especially those parts of the law that dealt with ethical behavior. He was concerned, however, that the pressures of living in a predominantly pagan city might cause some of them to waver in their faithfulness to these teachings. Thessalonica was steeped in pagan worship, including idolatry, sexual immorality, and civic religious festivals. These were difficult temptations for new converts who had once been immersed in such practices. Paul's letters, particularly 1 Thessalonians, reflect his concern for the community to remain steadfast in their moral conduct, which was deeply aligned with Torah values. In 1 Thessalonians 4 verses 1-8, Paul urged them to live in a way that is pleasing to God, and to continue to avoid sexual immorality, a behavior strictly forbidden in the Torah. He reminded them that God had called them to a life of holiness, not impurity, reinforcing the importance of remaining distinct from the pagan practices surrounding them. Paul's emphasis on avoiding idolatry, sexual immorality, and unjust practices echoed key Torah commands. He knew that the Thessalonian believers, particularly the Gentile converts, were trying to distance themselves from their former lives. Many had already adopted aspects of Torah ethics, especially in areas of monotheism, personal holiness, and community justice. Paul's letters encouraged them to continue in this path. In 1 Thessalonians 1 verses 9-10, Paul commended the believers for turning away from idols to serve the living and true God, a clear reflection of the first commandment in the Torah, "You shall have no other gods before me," Exodus 20 verse 3. Their rejection of idolatry was not just a sign of conversion but also a sign of their commitment to the ethical monotheism found in the Torah. Similarly, Paul's instruction in 1 Thessalonians 4 verses 3-5, where he warns them against sexual immorality, echoes the Torah's prohibitions found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. For the Jewish believers, this would have been a natural part of their faith, and for the Gentile converts, it was part of the moral code they were learning and striving to uphold. Paul urged the Thessalonian believers to reject idolatry, noting that their turning to the living and true God, 1 Thessalonians 1 verse 9, was a key aspect of their conversion. This was critical, as the pervasive pagan culture tempted believers to return to their old ways, including participating in idol worship and immoral practices. Paul warned against being lured back into these customs, especially as new believers faced persecution and social pressure from their pagan neighbors. He also encouraged them to support one another in faith, reminding them that their hope lay in the coming of Christ, who would deliver them from the trials they faced. Though Paul's primary audience included Gentile converts, his Jewish background and deep knowledge of the Torah influenced his teachings. While Paul did not impose the full observance of the Torah, Jewish law, on Gentile believers, he did stress moral and ethical principles that aligned with the Torah's values. He encouraged the Thessalonian Christians to maintain a lifestyle that reflected their new identity in Christ, including avoiding idolatry, which was explicitly condemned in the Torah. Paul's teachings emphasized that faith in Jesus fulfilled the law's intent, Romans 3 verse 31, and that following Christ meant living in holiness, distinct from the pagan ways of life around them. Paul urged the Thessalonian believers to reject idolatry, noting that their turning to the living and true God, 1 Thessalonians 1 verse 9, was a key aspect of their conversion. This was critical, as the pervasive pagan culture tempted believers to return to their old ways, including participating in idol worship and immoral practices. Paul warned against being lured back into these customs, especially as new believers faced persecution and social pressure from their pagan neighbors. He also encouraged them to support one another in faith, reminding them that their hope lay in the coming of Christ, who would deliver them from the trials they faced. In Paul's time, sexual practices were often integral to pagan religious rituals, including temple prostitution and fertility rites, as seen in the worship of gods like Aphrodite and Dionysus, where sexual immorality was considered a form of devotion. Idolatry also involved setting up physical statues and altars to honor these gods, often accompanied by feasts, orgies, and sacrifices. Flesh mutilation, such as self-inflicted wounds or cutting, was part of certain cult practices, like those dedicated to Cybele, to show extreme devotion or seek favor from the gods. In modern times, though explicit pagan rituals have largely faded, the idolatry of materialism, body worship, and even the normalization of extreme body modifications and hypersexuality in some cultures echo these ancient practices. The societal shift from biblical moral principles to a more permissive stance on sexuality, combined with the consumerist worship of wealth and self-image, reflects a contemporary form of idolatry, much like the physical idol worship in Paul's era. Today's world mirrors Paul's era in striking ways, particularly in the widespread normalization of sexual immorality through pornography, strip clubs, and bars, much like the sexual rituals tied to pagan temples in his time. Just as temple prostitution and public sexual rites were commonplace in the worship of deities like Aphrodite, today's culture commodifies sex, making it accessible through pornography and adult entertainment, which often parallels the same disregard for sexual purity that Paul condemned. Additionally, modern holidays such as Christmas and Easter, which have roots in pagan festivals like Saturnalia and the spring equinox, along with Halloween, carry forward many traditions that blend pagan rituals with contemporary celebrations. The widespread materialism, idolization of pleasure, and disregard for biblical moral boundaries in today's society echo the idolatry and sexual excess of Paul's pagan world. Paul's letters to the Thessalonians reflect his deep concern for a community that had already begun to embrace Torah ethics as part of their Christian faith. His teachings consistently pointed back to the moral and ethical principles found in the Torah. He encouraged the Thessalonian believers to remain faithful to these principles, especially in resisting the temptations of idolatry and immorality that were so prevalent in their culture. Paul's pastoral guidance was aimed at helping them continue to live lives of holiness, in line with the ethical teachings of the Torah, while also embracing the fullness of their new identity in Christ. Paul was never against the Torah, the law, and did not teach others to reject it. Rather, he affirmed its importance and expected believers to uphold its moral and ethical commands. He viewed the law as holy and righteous, Romans 7 verse 12, and emphasized that faith in Jesus fulfilled its deeper spiritual meaning. Paul's teachings focused on aligning the law with the new covenant in Christ, urging believers to maintain its principles of holiness and love, while understanding that salvation came through faith, not by the works of the law alone. He expected believers to keep the law's moral code until the return of Christ, guiding them to live in righteousness and faithfulness. Until next post, Shalom.